Now, this is the second part of our lecture, interviewing candidates. 3 ways to make interview useful. Interviews hold an ironic place in the hiring process. Everyone uses them, but they are generally not particularly valid. The knack is in doing them properly. If you do, then the interview is generally a good predictor of performance and is comparable with many other selection techniques. There are 3 things to keep in mind. Number 1, structure the interview to increase its validity. First, structure the interview, because structured interviews, particularly the structured interviews using situational equations, are more valid than unstructured interviews for predicting job performance. They are more valid partly because they are more reliable. Reason? The same interviewer administers the interview more consistently from candidate to candidate. Situational interviews yield a higher mean validity than do job-related interviews. That is, the behavioral interviews, or you can say, which in turn yields a higher mean validity than do psychological interviews, which focus more on motives and interests. Right? Next is, carefully choose what sort of traits are to be assessed. Because interviews are better for revealing some traits than others. A typical study illustrates this. Interviews were able to size up the interviewee extroversion and agreeableness. What they could not assess accurately were the traits that often matter most on jobs, like consciousness and emotional stability. The implication seems to be, don't focus on the hard to assess trait like consciousness. Limit yourself mostly to situational and job knowledge questions that help you assess how the candidate will actually respond to typical situations on that job. Now, next is, be aware of committing interviewing errors. This is very important thing. Understand, avoid the various errors that can undermine any interview usefulness. I hope these 3 ways are clear to you all to make interview useful. Now moving on to this thing. What can undermine an interview's usefulness? There are 6 points that you need to consider. They are actually the factors that affect an interview's usefulness. First is first impression, the snap judgment. Now, what is this snap judgment? Interviews misunderstanding of the job, candidates order, contrast error, and pressure to hire. All these things I'm going to discuss with you in the next slide. Now, first impression, what is it? It is the propensity of an interviewer to make an instant judgment about the candidate during the initial few minutes of the interview. Next is misunderstanding the job. This is one of the factor. Now, what it is actually, it says lack of information regarding job requirements and applicants' traits to perform that job leads to an interviewer decision that is based on incorrect impression or stereotypes of what a good applicant is. Candidate order error. The order followed during an interview also affect the interview selection decision. Non-verbal behavior and impression management. Non-verbal behavior of interviewee like smile, gestures, eye gaze, all these have an impact on interviewer rating. Effect of personal characteristics, attractiveness, gender, race. Effect of interviewees' personal characteristics like physical unattractiveness, racial background, disability, all these things have an effect on interviewer's decision. Interviewers' behavior affecting interviewing outcome. Behavior such as talking too much or letting the applicant to dominate the interview also affects interview outcomes. Now, How to design and conduct an effective interview. Use either situational questions or behavior questions that yield high criteria related validities. The first step, there are basically many steps that you need to consider for an effective, to design an effective interview. Now, the first step is basically analyze the job. Second, rate the job's main duties. Third, create interview questions. Fourth, create benchmark answer. Fifth, appoint interview panel and conduct interview. I'll explain you this one by one. Analyze the job, what it is. Here, you are supposed to analyze the job by writing a job description with a list of job duties, required knowledge, skills and abilities, and other worker qualifications. Second step says rate the job's main duties. That means rate each job duty, say for example 1 till 5, based on its importance to job success. Third step, create interview questions. You can create interview questions for each of the job duties, with more questions for the more important duties. Fourth step, create benchmark answer. Like next, for each question, develop ideal, the benchmark answer for good, say for example 5 rating, marginal 3 rating, poor 1 rating. And for the answers, 3 benchmark answers from low to high. Next step is appoint the interview panel and conduct interviews. Employers generally conduct structured situational interviews using a panel rather than one-on-one. The panel usually consists of 3 to 6 members, preferably the same ones who wrote the question and answer. It may also include job supervisor or incumbent and a human resource representative. The same panel interviews all candidates for the job. The panel member generally review the job description, questions, and benchmark answer before the interview. One panel member introduces the applicant and asks all the questions of all applicants in this way and succeeding candidates' interviews. However, all panel members record and rate the applicant's answer on the rating sheet. They do this by indicating where the candidate's answer to each question falls relative to the ideal, poor, marginal, or good answers. At the end of interview, someone answer any question to the applicant has. Right? Now, next is ways to make interview useful. There are ways to make interview useful. First is use structured situation interview. Second is cautiously select traits to assess. Third, be cautious of pledging interview errors. Now, design structured interviews by using situational queries, as structured interviews are more valid and reliable than unstructured ones. Focus on applicant's personal trait and cultural fit should be the main concern of the interviewer. In determining the right people, the good to great companies place greater weight on character attributes than on a specific educational background, practical skills, specialized knowledge, or work experience. This is what's been said by Jim Collins. Proper knowledge regarding job requirement can decrease the chances of error. So these are the ways that can make interview useful. Now, this is the last topic of this chapter. It is how to conduct a more effective interview. You may not have the time or inclination to create structured situational interviews. However, there is still much you can do to make your interviews more systematic and effective. You see, these are the points that you need to consider. First is you should know the job. Second, you should structure the interview. Third, get yourself organized. Fourth, establish rapport. Fifth, ask question. Sixth, take brief, unobtrusive notes. Seventh is close the interview. Now I'll explain to you all these things, all these steps one by one. Step one, which is know the job. First, make sure you know the job. Do not start the interview unless you understand the job and what human skills you are looking for. Study the job description in detail. Step 2. Structure the interview. Any structuring is better than none. If pressed for time, you can do several things to ask more consistent and job relevant questions without developing a full-blown structured interview. They may include, number one, base questions on actual job duties. This will minimize irrelevant questions. Use job knowledge situation or behavioral questions. Use same questions with all the candidates. Use descriptive rating scales. If possible, use a standardized interview form. This will help you to structure the interview, right? Third step is get organized. Hold the interview in a private room where telephone calls are not accepted and you can minimize interruptions. Prior to the interview, review the candidate's application and resume and note any areas that are vague or that may indicate strength or weaknesses. Fourth is establish rapport. The main reason for interview is to find out about the applicant. To do this, start by putting the person at ease. Greet the candidate and start the interview by asking a non-controversial question, perhaps about the weather or the traffic conditions or the day. As a rule, all applicants should receive friendly, courteous treatment, not only on humanitarian ground, but also your reputation is on the line. You have to be very careful. Fifth is ask questions. Try to follow situational, behavioral, and job knowledge questions you wrote out ahead of time, such as, what did you most enjoy about your last job? Next is take brief, unobtrusive notes during the interview. Take notes, jotting down just the key point of what the interview say. Seventh, close the interview. Leave time to answer any question the candidate may have and, if appropriate, to advocate your firm to the candidate. Try to end the interview on a positive note. Tell the applicant where there is interest and, if so, what the next step will be. Very important thing is that make rejections diplomatically. For instance, you can say, although your background is impressive, there are some other candidates whose experience is more closer to our requirement. If the applicant is still under consideration, but you can't reach a decision now, simply say no. Remember, as one recruiter says, an interview experience should leave a lasting positive impression of the company, whether the candidate receives and accepts an offer or not. Okay? Now, last point, close the interview. Review the interview after the candidate leaves. Review your interview, the notes, score the interview guides, answer if you used anyone. And after doing that, you can make decision, right? This is the last point, which is reviewing the interview. So add over here after closing the interview, right? This is very important thing. You should review your interview after the candidate leaves, right? So this is how you can conduct a more effective interview. I hope these points are very clear to you all because I have explained each and every step in detail. Okay, but still, if you have any query, any problem, you can ask me through an email, right? Thank you so much, students.